Good afternoon. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's program featuring Aslı Bâli in conversation with Asim Khwaja. Before I introduce our speakers, let me gratefully acknowledge the Mishra Family Dean's Leadership Fund, which is supporting this event. I'd also like to thank members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors whose generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. Our program this afternoon is the second in a series focused on open dialogue about issues related to the Middle East. In particular, these discussions consider questions about modern Jewish and modern Arab and Muslim identity in the context of university, local, and worldwide events. Earlier this month, I was in conversation with my colleague, Noah Feldman, Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, about his recent book titled To Be a Jew Today, A New Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People. If you weren't able to attend, I encourage you to visit Radcliffe's website to view a recording of the program. This series is a part of Radcliffe's broader initiative on academic freedom and connecting across difference, which launched earlier this year. This multi-year effort seeks to uphold the mission of higher education by ensuring the academic freedoms to learn, to teach, and to pursue research. An important aspect of this work concerns developing and modeling ways to foster productive and respectful dialogue, even and especially when we disagree. In pursuing this initiative, Radcliffe is also working alongside others from across the university engaged in addressing pressing issues of the day. I was honored to co-chair with Professor Eric Bierbaum Harvard's Open Inquiry and Constructive Dialogue Working Group, which President Garber and Provost Manning initiated this past spring. The working group released its report and recommendations in October, and I hope you read our important findings if you haven't already done so. As the report concluded, open inquiry and constructive dialogue are essential to the pursuit of academic excellence and require the free and respectful exchange of ideas. In that spirit, I ask that we engage one another today as generous listeners with open minds and open hearts. And now I'm pleased to introduce this afternoon's speakers. I'll provide brief highlights from their extensive professional work, and you can find their full bios on Radcliffe's webpage. Aslı Bâli is Harvard M. Holtzman Professor of Law at Yale Law School. In addition, she is president of the Middle East Studies Association and co-chair of the advisory board for Middle East Division of Human Rights Watch. Previously, she served as founding faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and as director of the Center for Near Eastern Studies at UCLA, where she was also a professor of law. Aslı's international law expertise spanned scholarship and practice. Her research examines public international law, particularly human rights law, and the law of the International Security Order, and comparative constitutional law with a focus on the Middle East. Prior to joining academia, she worked for the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and for a number of local and transnational human rights organizations in the Middle East. Asim Khwaja is the Sumitomo Foundation for Advanced Studies on International Development, Professor of International Finance and Development at the Harvard Kennedy School, Visiting Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, and Director of Harvard's Center for International Development. He's also co-founder of the Center for Economic Research, Pakistan. In addition, Asim serves as co-chair of Harvard's Presidential Task Force on Combating Anti-Muslim, Anti-Arab, and Anti-Palestinian Bias. Asim's scholarly interests include economic development, education, finance, political economy, institutions, and contract theory and mechanism design. His work engages policy questions and draws upon microeconomic theory, extensive fieldwork, and empirical analysis. I'm very glad to welcome Asim and Aslı to Radcliffe today. After their discussion, we'll turn to audience questions. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any point during the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief so we can address as many of them as possible. Now, I'm pleased to give the virtual floor to Aslı Bâli and Asim Khwaja.
Great. Thank you so much, Tomiko, for that introduction. Aslı, I just wanted to start by thanking you. I know time is extremely precious. I know these topics are hard to talk about. I'm just super grateful that you're willing to spend time with us virtually today. But also, I find, the more I sort of look at your background, the more remarkable I feel you are, both as someone who's clearly an academic and an intellect in this field, but someone who's practiced as well. And that's a rare combination, and one I think that gives a lot of richness to your views, and I expect to our conversation today as well. So let me just jump straight in, Aslı, with your permission. In many ways, October 7th has been a watershed moment across campuses in the US, across the world. But you and I have both at least lived long enough to have experienced a previous watershed moment, which was 9/11 for a lot of people who are Muslims or Arabs. And in fact, there are many other watershed moments before that as well. And so I'd like to start off by asking you to situate us, at least in that post and pre-9/11 moment, and just walk us through. I know you were at that time kind of both practicing and studying. Walk us through kind of how you felt the Muslim community was affected, at least post 9/11. And the general increasing focus that was put on Muslims and Arabs in the US at that time and globally as well. And then as you talk through, walk us back from that previous moment. And is this, how unique was this? Or was this just kind of business as usual faced by a lot of members of our community?
Thank you so much, Asim, for having me, and Tomiko and everyone who was involved with organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I have, of course, the professional deformation of looking at this through the law. And so perhaps I will use that as my prism to answer this initial question. And as you say, it's 9/11, of course, September 11th was a major watershed for the Muslim community in the United States, but it wasn't the first pivot. There was also an earlier time in response to the Iranian Revolution where there were a range of changes. And actually, we can go further back than that, because one of the unique experiences of Muslim Americans, I think, and then this, of course, has its reverberations globally, is the conflation of our identity category or the racialization of that category around tropes of terrorism. And that too has been at issue in the post-October 7th climate. And interestingly, there was a recent white paper from the Center for Constitutional Rights, which was commissioned by them. It was done by the professor of law and anthropology, Darrell Lee at University of Chicago, that traced the origins of terrorism laws in this country back to the very first mention in a federal statute, which was in the 1960s. It was actually in 1969. And it was a statute that dealt with restricting humanitarian assistance to Palestinians. So the very first instance in which the word terrorism has any legal definition is actually already exemplifying the ways in which the conflicts in the Middle East, the involvement of Muslim communities is being framed around this incipient category for the US. And then the US government in the 1970s began to develop blacklists of organizations on the grounds of allegations of terrorism. And again, these were entirely foreign organizations. And in fact, this is of note because even when responding through federal legislation to a purely domestic incident of terrorism, so for example, the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, the result was still new federal law addressing anti-terrorism provisions that was entirely focused abroad and entirely responsive to alleged threats, foreign threats, which were presented again as primarily threats related to groups supporting Palestinians or supporting Muslims. So that was a backdrop that already existed prior to the September 11th attacks. And then post 9/11 law and policy, of course, built on those earlier foundations and began initially with things like selective enforcement of existing laws. So as you said, I was in practice. One of the very first things that happened was selective enforcement of immigration laws to simply sweep up in mass arrests as many Muslim immigrant men as possible, taxi drivers, bodega owners, whatever, and to hold them on suspicion of involvement with the attacks to release them only after they'd been cleared. So, of course, reversing the presumption of innocence to a presumption of guilt. And they were held as a being of special interest to the Attorney General. And this caught up thousands of men from South Asia, from the Middle East, et cetera, that had, of course, not one prosecution relating to terrorism ever emerged out of those initial waves of arrests, but it created a massive chill through the entire community. And then other steps were added, material support laws that said forms of speech that had no connection to financing, no connection to weapons, but seemed to be supportive of viewpoints that were connected to designated entities could be forms of terrorism. So speech and dissent, particularly again relating to Palestine, could be a basis on which to be criminally prosecuted. Or, for example, the special registration system, which required men with valid visas to report themselves into immigration offices around the country in order to answer extensive questionnaires, et cetera, and be added to a database. Failure to participate in that registration process resulted in a technical violation of your visa. So the valid visa you entered the country with was invalidated by virtue of your non-registration. So you had to register. Again, tens of thousands of people faced panic. There were deportations that were related to registration or non-registration. Again, not a single terrorism-related conviction followed from the coerced registration of tens of thousands of people. There was an exponential increase in mass surveillance with intense scrutiny of Muslim American communities in particular. And these government racial profiling practices, that is to say, practices that singled out Muslims and people of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Arab descent for enhanced scrutiny, produced presumptions of disloyalty and also engendered heightened punishments through our criminal justice system under far-reaching material support and other counts, essentially producing a system of preventive policing and presumptive guilt. Against this backdrop, we also then had, of course, a massive increase in private forms of racial profiling and hate crimes, because you're getting official messaging that says this community is suspect, this community is dangerous, this community is likely to produce instability, violence, etc. And so effectively, the Muslim community in this country became the most intensely policed and securitized community. And it was racialized through this process as a community that was ironically not formally entitled to protections against racial discrimination, because also we're not counted in censuses in general. We're not a protected category as such of the historically disadvantaged communities. Now, of course, there were good elements to some of this, which is this was also a community that was historically disconnected from civil rights organizing in this country, that was really defined as a series of diaspora immigrant communities that were not well connected to one another. Someone went to a Pakistani mosque, someone else went to a Yemeni mosque, someone else went to whatever. And those community organizations and bridges to civil rights organizing and creation of a cohesive political identity in this country emerged, such that, as an example, at the time that I was going through law school, there were very few, almost none, actually, in the particular law school I was at, Muslim students in the JD program, in the basic training program to get a law degree in the United States. Today, that would be unthinkable. All of the major law schools have very substantial numbers of Muslims, people of Middle Eastern, South Asian descent going to law school. We have a generation of students that have graduated and have become prominent lawyers. We now have, for the first time, some federal court judges that are of Muslim background. In other words, some things, some ways in which the community has gone through this experience have produced a kind of typical immigrant path, if you want, for Muslims. But it has also left us with this burden and stigmata, both from the government and from private profiling. And most recently, even under the Trump administration, decades after the September 11th attacks, still we see government-sanctioned profiling in the form, for example, of a Muslim ban openly defended through anti-Muslim animus by the president and by his entourage, and eventually rendered constitutional by the Supreme Court. So that has been the backdrop against which, of general sentiment and general experience of repression, against which Muslims, Arabs, persons of South Asian descent have experienced the intensification of speech-based repression since October 7th.
So that's very thorough. I appreciate it. Actually, very sobering, with a slight glimmer of hope that I guess nothing like persecution to bring a community together. Before we move to October 7th, I want to kind of, the important thing in 9/11 is, in some sense, we've seen how history has unraveled post 9/11. In physics, we have a concept called hysteresis, which is, when you push a system, it has a tendency to try and revert back to, or not. And so I guess my question to you is, when we think of not just Muslims, but, think of Asian Americans post-World Wars, there is a history, not just in the US, but other countries, that an event occurs, there's a party which is kind of blamed for the event, and a series of repressive acts occur. My question to you is it just it's time for Group A right now, and eventually it'll die out and Group B will emerge? Like, are we almost being protected by the fact that some other group is going to show up and kind of are out of the limelight? Or do these things build up? Do these accumulate? So the next event creates an even bigger reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I worry about that possibility, the latter dynamic. So, of course, I mean, nation states as a general matter, not just the United States, produce permanent majorities, permanent minorities, for one thing. This country is exceptional in some ways in that it has a continuing flow of immigrants. That is, until now. I mean, the current anti-immigrant sentiment may actually alter that trajectory somewhat. But as a consequence, you have a kind of shifting demographic to an extent that is rare amongst states in the international system. And that has lent itself to the cyclical dimension that you're describing, where there are favored groups and disfavored groups from amongst the many minorities that make up a plurality in this country. And one of the phenomena that we're witnessing, I think, is a real reactionary backlash amongst the presumptive majority community as they face the possibility of becoming themselves a plurality. That is, the possibility that we might become a majority minority country has obviously triggered massive demographic anxieties. But the one thing I do think is clear is that we're still on a trajectory, unfortunately, in which there is disproportionate attention, not just domestically in the US, but also as a kind of refraction of the centrality that the Middle East continues to command. And here I mean the Middle East broadly construed to encompass the broader Muslim world, to encompass, for example, Pakistan, Afghanistan, other parts of Southeast Asia, also parts of Africa, Nigeria, et cetera. So this more broadly construed, if you say Muslim world, that happens to sit at geopolitical cross-sections in rivalries that are rising between the West and Asia, at the heart of concentrations of natural resources that remain still central to models of economic growth, et cetera. So as a consequence of that centrality and the conflicts now raging, many of which conflicts that the United States is a direct participant in or has been the accelerant of, the likelihood of this community finding itself no longer in the crosshairs anytime in the near future, I think, is still some way off.
Another sobering thought, but I think you're right. Sadly, there's a likelihood of a series of other events or the other which draw attention to Muslims and Arabs.
And one other thing, if I could just interject, I mean, we shouldn't look away from the fact that the death toll in the Muslim world as a consequence of this focus has been astonishing and outstripped anything else in the post-World War II era. It's just millions and millions of people when you take into account those killed in conflicts that involve the West, those killed in conflicts that have been triggered by some aspect of these dilemmas, from Afghanistan to Libya to Tunisia to Yemen. I mean, you can just look across the Muslim world and see the ravages. And of course, therefore, those communities that are diaspora communities, one way or another, here in the United States, are experiencing constantly the waves of grief and trauma that are emanating back and are constantly experiencing their connections to the region as both a basis for feeling insecure here and also not really having a secure place there, if you want, overseas to identify with either.
I think you're right. Like, I was, before our conversation, I was just trying to get some estimates on post 9/11. What was a loss of life in Afghanistan over the next ensuing years and decades. And it's hard to find those estimates because we don't easily produce them. And I was just trying to figure out, like, how bad and how long-term are the consequences of these initial sort of events. And just the fact that those are hard to estimate suggests that, there's lack of attention to those numbers as well. They kind of are diffused over a much longer period. I want to flip to something you said on the kind of quasi-positive side, which is at least a coming together of community members, Muslim and Arabs, recognizing just simple statistics like how many people are in law school now. What other things did you see? So I guess my question is towards what agency do community members have? Is it incumbent upon them to kind of react to these forces? A lot of people in our communities are kind of frustrated and want to make a difference. Again, using the 9/11 experience, what did you see in addition to what you said, which have sense of that agency and ability that we can draw on them in the current event and perhaps future events as well?
Well, I think part of this is what explains what's actually happened on our campuses as well, which is that there's a growing awareness amongst Americans of all backgrounds of some of the things that have been truly unjust consequences of the wars that have been waged in these regions, and some of the really excessive policing and overcriminalization that occurs post 9/11 as well. And so what we saw, for example, in the last year is the broadest, widest mobilization ever in support of Palestinian rights in the United States. And that occurred not because there were more Arab or Muslim students in law schools. It occurred because non-Arab, non-Muslim students were making common cause very broadly around solidarity with a community that they don't identify with on any ethnic basis. And part of that is because after a quarter century or more, and for students that are now at universities who've grown up entirely in this period, there is a heightened understanding and awareness of our regions and their histories that I think didn't really exist in the same ways. And so, of course, there is agency amongst Muslims in the United States and Arab, South Asian, broader communities. But also there is a reality of reckoning with the long-term relationship that the United States has had to many of the destabilizing events in these regions, and an understanding that there is some accountability, that there's some responsibility. And as we hurtle towards climate catastrophe and climate crisis, some of the things that have made our parts of the world so geopolitically central are themselves being interrogated again from a different perspective, from a climate perspective. So it brings many people together in solidarity in ways that I think would have been unthinkable at the end of the 20th century.
I think that's very interesting. And in many ways, what you said just resonates a lot with me, now coming to October 7th. What I have found striking exactly is what you said, which is even when you look at students who are protesting or students who may have been suspended, a lot of them are not Arab or Muslim. They're African Americans, they're Asian Americans, they're white Americans, they're Jewish Americans. And am I right in hearing you say that's a new phenomena, or the seeds of that phenomena are always there? There are also many conversations which are coalescing. DEI is coalescing with these conversations. And so is this a grouping together of all people who feel persecuted coming together? Is the camp getting bigger and bigger?
Yeah, there's certainly a convergence of sort of right-wing backlash politics that maybe some of this, as you say, there's the anti-DEI state level initiatives that trucked in many of the same kinds of tropes. Some of the people that were most active there have been very active in demanding, putting external pressure on universities and demanding a repressive environment around the expression of dissent to American foreign policy. So there is that kind of convergence. But I also think the seeds have long been there. If we go back to the civil rights movement at an earlier time when Muslim Americans weren't the ones necessarily at the center, you saw all kinds of communities, not necessarily directly affected by, for example, the politics of desegregation, but making common cause and mobilizing together. And so you saw, for example, rabbis at the forefront, oftentimes, locking arms with African-American civil rights leaders. And I think that instinct amongst many communities to come to the defense of groups that they think are being subjected to discriminatory treatment, or to join and lock arms and protest at some of the most extreme kinds of policies that may be doing harm globally, from the United States, from the Vietnam protests to the civil rights movement to today, are durable and cyclical patterns in the United States. But I do think the idea that these patterns have also expressed themselves through a much wider tent than I had previously seen around pro-Palestinian solidarity and expressions of support for Palestinians, and also criticism of the American policy choices that were enabling what many have viewed as destructive Israeli government policies. All of this being at the center of a kind of civil rights style mobilization, I think is new and is a broader tent than we've seen previously.
But is this just, not to diminish it by any means, I apologize asking this, but is this just a collective of the disempowered? Or are we also seeing people in power deciding to break out from that privilege in defense of some of these issues?
Well, it depends on who you mean by in power. Of course, we're not seeing a lot of government support for these views and these, and we saw very clearly that neither political party was willing to, for example, include in its platform or allow to share a stage with anybody expressing these views that were so widely heard across campuses and across cities in the United States last year. On the other hand, if you mean, are there people from sort of majority or elite backgrounds in the United States joining these protests? That's clearly the case. And I think one of the things that's an indicator of this is that so many of the voices most critical of Israeli policies and practices on campuses have themselves been Jewish students or students that had grown up identifying with Israel and don't understand themselves as such to be persecuted in this moment. It's not that they worry that they themselves are the targets of either Israeli government policy or American foreign policy, but rather they see a sort of broader form of solidarity that's mobilizing them. Now, of course, to be sure, there are also any number of Jewish American and students and other communities from Jewish background or that identify with Israel that are taking the opposite view. That's no doubt the case. But what I'm just saying is, in connection to speech that has long historically been identified with Muslim communities as pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian, et cetera, that has been such a disfavored perspective for over a quarter century that to see a massive mobilization on campuses across the country that are so diverse, that are not being led particularly by Arabs or Muslims, although of course Arab and Muslim students were also present, is itself striking and a departure. And I don't think it's can best be characterized as just a coalition of the persecuted, as you had suggested. I think it's broader than that.
As we think about bringing about change, and in some sense, change is towards a world where the loss of life is equally felt and affects us all. Perhaps that's too naive a view of the world, but it's one I'd hope we'd aspire to. You mentioned one kind of group, which is lawyers, legal rights. I want to turn, you obviously wear another hat as well, which is you head MESA. And now this is a coalition of academics, of scholars. And, in a previous conversation, we were sort of talking about this, how neither of us are either Arab or Palestinian. And yet here we are having a conversation about these events. As someone leading kind of scholarship now in this field, is that a movement which is beginning to happen? Should it happen? Would it have any effect if it did happen?
Okay, so a couple of things. First, I do want to note one thing about our own respective identities as someone who is originally South Asian Muslim, for me, originally from Turkey, Muslim, Turkish American. I do think that there was another post 9/11 phenomenon that I worry about, which is the phenomenon of distinguishing good Muslims from bad Muslims and finding the right interlocutor, if you want, from amongst Muslims, which almost always meant non-Arab interlocutor, so that you could have a version of a conversation that was some kind of a pale approximation of, track two conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which American Jewish speakers were cast as somehow the ambassadors of Israel, and then Muslims, but typically non-Arab Muslims, were cast as the ambassadors of the other perspective, whatever it was meant to be. And that, I think, those kinds of Muslim-Jewish dialogue events or efforts to have, interfaith community, et cetera, that privileged Indonesian Muslims or Nigerian Muslims or whatever category to avoid Arab Muslims, or particularly Palestinian Muslims, was very, very problematic. And the more general efforts by government to say, this is good Islam, this is bad Islam, these are trustworthy Muslims, these are bad Muslims, all of this is something I have long resisted contributing to. And so it is notable that neither one of us comes from an Arab background as we're discussing these issues, and that often that's the case of those who get recruited onto task force and so forth at universities and elsewhere. Not all Muslims, of course, it's worth saying, have strong views about Palestine. Many of them may think, well, the Palestinian question is an important question, and as are many others. Sudan is a very important question. What's happening in South Asia post-withdrawal from Afghanistan is a very important question, and so on. So the presumption that we know what the views of people are is problematic, and we've just spoke a moment ago about the incredible diversity of views within the Jewish American community. And one of the sort of flattening effects of the framing of Muslim, Arab, South Asian, Middle Eastern, et cetera, since post 9/11 has been the presumption of some kind of monolithic community of one view. And I would want to resist that. Now, having said that, I am indeed president of the Middle East Studies Association, and that's quite a different thing. That's a collection of nearly 3,000 scholars who are in the fields from anthropology and archaeology to history and comparative literature and what have you in the humanities and social sciences that study the Middle East. And as a society, we have long had a committee on academic freedom. And that committee is divided into two wings, a Middle East North Africa wing and a North America wing. And historically, the MENA wing has been by far the most active, writing very actively about the kinds of, just astonishing violations of academic freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly that have taken place in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly after the Arab uprisings, but also after the Green Movement in Iran, after the Gezi protests in Turkey. It was, dozens of letters a year to any number of countries, et cetera. And the North America wing would have, its occasional work. I mean, it was we looked at academic freedom questions in the field of Middle East studies in particular. And so, our work drib drab of things to do. Post October 7th, that equation is completely reversed. And one of the more alarming things from my own perspective is the degree to which we see forms of repression on American campuses that absolutely mirror the most extreme authoritarian excesses in the Middle East and North Africa, including in Turkey, which I've studied very closely. The idea of sudden ad hoc policies that are selectively enforced, that are viewpoint specific, that basically impose allegedly neutral criteria to exclusively disallow particular kinds of protests, that call the police onto campuses, that criminalize students, that use trespass laws and other kinds of rules to enable the arrest of students and then disclaim responsibility for the consequences that then flow for students, that impose harsh disciplinary sanctions for disfavored political views, and the witnessing of the spectacle of congressional inquiries that call university presidents to account in inquisitorial settings, dramatizing external, both political and donor pressures on universities to crack down on disfavored views, and then to watch universities have political, financial, legal incentives to actually engage in that crackdown and do so, I think, in quite disingenuous ways, adopting what has been a pattern that looks like one playbook across the country from campus to campus, adopting institutional neutrality statements that I think are misguided in the particulars of what they're going to be neutral about, and new time, place, and manner restrictions that essentially make it impossible or nearly impossible to engage in meaningful protest spontaneously or in ways that can be heard by one's fellow campus members, and engaging in surveillance practices and the invitation of security forces onto campuses that really resemble nothing more than the authoritarian practices of other states. And so I really very much hope that this kind of repression, which again was against the expression of viewpoints that were pro-Palestinian, but that ended up targeting a very broad cross-section of students that were involved in those protests and have succeeded in repressing many of those voices, have succeeded in teaching the lesson that disfavored views will bring unwanted discipline and criminal sanction against those who express them, and that you are better off being silent or finding ways to accommodate power, because power will crush you, even in campus communities that are designed to be laboratories in which students are supposed to be able to experiment with free inquiry and free expression and association. And they're communities that have a pedagogical character, very different from all other communities, in which the university stands in a very different relationship, is a custodian of many things for these students, including the high obligation to instill in them practices of critical inquiry. All of that was retreated from in a way that I found really demoralizing.
So that's a lot to swallow. It does resonate, unfortunately, with a lot of what's happening, what we have academics have experienced as well. Are we just borrowing from repressive regimes' page books over here? Are we borrowing from non-university settings within the US over here? Is this a new thing for universities to be getting into?
Well, one of the things that I think is new is the degree to which there has been concerted external pressure, both from government suddenly having, Congress be willing to reach in and abrogate independence and autonomy of higher education, and having moved to a model where universities are so dependent on a kind of privatized model of donor-driven centers and programs, et cetera, that they're vulnerable to forms of external pressure, that their incentives really have been aligned differently around financial and political risk. means that we're in a new environment. I think there was a fashion maybe 2 decades ago of talking about the neoliberal turn in higher education. And I think in some ways we're seeing the wages of that turn today in the amount of influence that can be brought to bear. But I also think there's just a worrying normalization of what was once seen as aberrant. So, for example, in the last 2016 election, the last time that President Trump was elected to office, promising a set of policies that were driven by open animus against Muslims, as I say. He promised a Muslim ban, he ensured that it would happen, and he promised to, rescind DACA, to go after immigrant communities. Many universities stood up and said, no, we will protect our communities. We will protect our students. We want to stand with our students and not tolerate this kind of animus. Today, there's a deafening silence in the face of much of this, because when a political actor is reelected who has promised these kinds of things, it's difficult to treat that as an aberration, and it begins to look like a durable shift to the right. And as we're seeing that durable shift to the right here, and universities are accommodating it and adjusting to it, we're also, of course, seeing a global trend, as you suggest, that makes it the case that the United States isn't necessarily at the vanguard of this kind of populist right-wing politics, but it has a set of playbooks that have been written in Hungary, in India, in places like Turkey, and indeed in Israel, that authorize this kind of repression on campuses. I just hope that we have longer standing institutional traditions of protecting autonomy in higher education, and that we can rediscover that pedagogical mission of the university and apply neutrality where it's due. I don't think it's appropriate for university presidents' offices to have ministries of foreign affairs, for sure. And so I think that it may be salutary to resist speaking on every foreign crisis. But on the other hand, universities have a very clear mission to protect the university and protect the communities within it when they are directly in the crosshairs, rather than succumb in advance and shift policies to accommodate calls for repression of academic freedom, of free inquiry, of searches of curricula and syllabi and so forth. So I do think there is a way to both honor some version of neutrality and also be viewpoint neutral in the enforcement of policies, and also continue to support free inquiry and free expression. And if we lose that, we've really lost something core to our mission in higher education and at our universities.
So I hear you, Aslı, but now the economist and org theorist in me kind of comes to bear on this, which is, in some sense, what you raise is a deeply troubling view of the world, which is there a buyer for free discourse? Is there a market where people really value free speech, academic freedom? You're right, it used to be universities, it used to be the funders of universities. And in some sense, universities were regarded as hallowed ground. I don't know if it was demanded that way, but it was a space where this could happen. In the picture that you're portraying, what worries me is who is this person who's going to wish for us to be places where true discourse can happen? Is there an employer out there? Is there some large firm which says, you know what, I really want the kind of student who really knows how to debate and have candid conversations? Because we talk about all of these things. This is happening on campuses. Every campus has now a candid conversation, something or the other. But I don't quite understand where this demand were to come from. And if it doesn't, then it worries me even more. Are you seeing someone who's going to buy this stuff?
I don't think it's as simple as imagining a market for it as such. It's more producing that market. And that's really the business of the university. I mean, that's the thing that requires forthright, vocal, public defense. A defense, it's actually a defense not just of critical inquiry, but also of core democratic commitments. I mean, democratic commitments to, being able to have an exchange of ideas between polarized camps, even to be able to give some kind of hearing to our co-citizens' views and to be able to come to deliberative decisions together. I mean, that's basically at the heart of our core political enterprise. I think we've definitely lost sight of it. And I think there's been a cultural shift away from it. But universities have a role there, not just to their internal communities, but also as spokespeople in our democracy. I mean, we are running what the closest that we have in this country to a model of what a civics education has to look like in a democracy. And we need to be able to model that internally and externally. We need to be able to say, oh, do we have financial and reputational risk that we're facing from external actors? The way we respond to that is by forthrightly defending our project and explaining that our reputation depends upon that. That's the thing that our reputation is in the possibility of maintaining a space for critical inquiry. And I think as public intellectuals, we have an obligation to offer that defense constantly. We have to push back by persuading our fellow citizens. I don't think there's a way to, imagine either out lawyering or out financing or what have you. It's to think of these war metaphors where we're somehow going to win the battle for this and that, or we're going to conquer some group. No, I think we have to persuade, and that's really the bread and butter, at least in the humanities and social sciences, of what we do. It's that kind of reasoning, it's that kind of logic. We just need to take it and have the courage of our convictions to defend these principles on those terms publicly all the time, as a pedagogical model for the nation, not just for those who are within our campus communities.
So again, since I guess we should disagree somewhere, to push a bit on that as well, is a failure ours? I mean, in many ways, whether it be the current US election or other countries, a rise of populism, it's not just financial elites, it's intellectual elites as well. Are we as academics becoming too much of intellectual elites and forgetting how to convince people in ways which is just like, I'm a professor, you should listen to me? Like, are we failing in candid conversations with our own community members, not just our students, but a wider community?
I mean, it somewhat depends on how we define the we, because of course we have a vibrant and enormous higher education sector in this country that is made up of public and private universities, community colleges, I mean, all kinds of ecosystems. And all of those are not, I mean, there's a way of kind of assimilating all of higher education to the hallowed, let's say, towers of Harvard University or Yale University, where I'm sitting, but we represent a micro, sort of percentage of what higher education actually is in the country. And in many places, it's incredibly embedded in the communities it's located in. I taught for a very long time at a public university at UCLA. We were very much a university of the community we were in, not just in terms of who came through our doors as students, but also how much we were beholden to the community that surrounded us, how much we were engaged with it. I think that is a model that private universities would do well to also follow. But I think the sort of populist narrative about universities, we should be wary of falling for that depiction of ourselves, because I think actually the notion that we're just made up of, elites in, fancy quarters having jargonized conversations with one another about high theory is pretty far from the reality of what the work of higher education is in this country. And that work has been the engine of one of the most powerful economies in the world as well. So it's been producing not only, leaders amongst our own citizenry, but globally, that have made the last 3/4 of a century possible as a period of enormous human flourishing. And to abandon all of that, or to imagine that that's somehow the domain of elites and needs to be repudiated in favor of some other anti-intellectual movement, I think is just to misunderstand the value we bring here and globally.
But Asli, if we were that connected, and let's take out the Harvards of the world and the Yales of the world, and I agree with you that we represent a very small fraction of what universities are doing in the world, but they haven't succeeded either. And so, like, the reality of what we're seeing is inconsistent with, if truly we were engaged in this way, fine, it would be fine to write off these Ivy League professors, but people should be coming out and saying that, the public universities should really have a strong say. Are they not defending freedom of speech enough? Are they not getting through to their own communities? Why is the trend across the board?
Well, I do think, as I said earlier, that there was this neoliberal turn. I don't think that public universities were spared it either. I mean, there's been a withdrawal of state funding. There's been a beholdenness to finance from a variety of arenas. There's been donor-driven developments, program and center developments. And so it's not necessarily always about the intellectual project. It's about what is actually going to attract lucrative funds. And all of that has, of course, produced a different set of incentives. What I'm saying is we need to get back to also communicating, to reminding our own alums of what the experience was that they had on these campuses and what the purpose of this education was and why they should be investing in it, rather than for simply the purpose of pursuing a pet project or something else. We need many, many more people willing to finance higher education on its own terms, because we're winning that argument. But we need to be making the argument. And I do think we have not been, in part because we've been busy pursuing funding on a series of other logics and arguments.
But we could, this is a a powerful and important conversation. We can keep going, but I'm cognizant of our time. I'm cognizant of the questions people are posing in our Q&A. I want to, a lot of this kind of disquietens us, and I'm sure our audience as well. These are all clouds emerging on our kind of already pretty overcast and pollution-filled skies. Where is a ray of hope? What gets you excited? What gets you happy? What gets you out every day to say, no, we're going to turn this around?
Well, one thing that's interesting is we began in a conversation about, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab bias, and we ended up in a full-throated discussion of academic freedom, et cetera. And the convergence of these two things in some ways, the fact that, at the sort of leading edge of demands, and they came from below, right? So we are succeeding at something. Our students are engaging in critical inquiry. Whether we're willing to allow it or not is a different question, in which they're questioning, what have been long-standing articles of faith about what policies should look like, how students should behave, et cetera. And they are creatively still trying to navigate the very rocky waters we've produced for them and the many impediments we've put in their way. But many, as I've said previously, have joined this debate. So this is not just, although it's true that expressions of some of the anger towards these protests and demands that they be repressed took the form, indeed, of anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab bias. And there were real instances of violence. There has been a kind of stigmatization of, for example, sartorial choices that are identified with the Arab world in ways that are reek of animus. And so there are real problems. But the fact that this has become such a much broader set of questions, and that we're actually asking some of the most fundamental questions once more in the face of real threats, but also with many allies joining us in that debate, is a source of, I think, at least some hope going forward. I mean, it is to us in any democracy to win the argument. I mean, that is how we proceed. And, I don't want to be overly naive. There's no doubt about it that money talks, that there are lots of things in our democratic system that have distorted our ability to debate freely, and that, the ways in which campaign finance and other things have shaped the political marketplace have been very damaging and are deeply tied to this last year of repression. But all of that notwithstanding, I think in many cases in the discussions that we've seen on campuses, the better argument has been heard. And, the better argument always has a prospect, at least, of prevailing.
I think kudos to you as an academic to always praise your students. And I think in many ways, you're right. What I find astounding in this is students have displayed a kind of courage, moral courage, intellectual valuation that somehow we, faculty and university leadership, seems to be shying away from. And it's remarkable. I mean, if we wanted to be somewhat self-congratulatory, we try to give attribution to us in enabling that. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's happening. And I think that's something worth celebrating for sure. And so I want to now turn to audience questions. While we've been talking, there's a bunch of questions, and we've tried to kind of group them. So I apologize to people as we're grouping them if we kind of mischaracterize them. But I'm seeing 3 or 4 broad themes. And so I'm going to kind of pose the broad themes as I read through these questions. And I'd love for you to react to them. And we only have about 12 minutes left. And so I think we can do this. So there is a first series of questions about just comparing 9/11 to now, right? These are questions about a lot of Muslim harassment post 9/11, although acknowledgement that the Republican administration somewhat pushed back against that. There was at least an attempt to say, well, this isn't right. And there's a question about, will a new administration, also Republican, kind of embrace that, at least in a broad principle sense, to say, no, this isn't right, what's happening? Or has this become so accepted now that that kind of pushback, that, if you will, some institutional stability is gone now? And there's a bunch of other questions around this about public opinion against Islam and the Quran, and people reacting by, this wasn't a great opportunity. If you hate Muslims, here, let me share a Quran with you. Why don't you read it and tell me what you would? So this is just a way of reaching out as well. And so just reactions to that.
Yeah, I mean, for starters, there has been a kind of systemic and decades-long normalization of discrimination against Palestinians specifically, and those that support their views, and then more broadly, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim biases, unfortunately. And one of the things that that has resulted in is underreporting, actually, globally. So we also don't have nearly an accurate understanding of what's going on campuses because people are afraid, quite reasonably, that if they report something that they may themselves become the target of an investigation or inquiry, because in reporting it, they would be conceding that they were involved in a speech act or a protest or something that drew attention to them. And so ultimately, it's very difficult to even gather good information, but we can see it very clearly and widely throughout the discourse. And that is a product of, the acceleration of this kind of thinking post 9/11. And so that's a real problem. And I think, unfortunately, the incoming administration has embraced a kind of open animus in its last 4 years in office. I mean, the first Trump administration that the Bush administration never engaged in. Now, I will say the Bush administration introduced a series of, as I described them, government authorized racial profiling programs that were so explicit and wide ranging that they did, of course, invite in practice all kinds of private racial profiling and hate crimes as well, even though as a formal matter, they decried those and they engaged in some symbolic efforts to reach out to the Muslim community in the United States, speak to imams and faith leaders and so forth. I don't expect to have, like whatever, Ramadan celebrations in the White House under the Trump administration, but I'm not sure how much difference they ultimately made in the end. So I think that what's instead interesting and different from the post 9/11 period, as I say, is the kind of breadth of mobilization and the diversity of people that see the problem of this kind of anti-Muslim animus. And so that to me is encouraging. On the other hand, I don't doubt that there have been an enormous spike in hate crimes and targeting of the Muslim community, and that wearing a keffiyeh in many parts of the country and on many campuses invites targeting. And I find that lamentable and truly heartbreaking.
Just on this kind of, if you will, non-state solutions. I mean, look, in many developing countries, we're pretty used to the state isn't quite doing what you want, and a very powerful non-state, whether it be informal mechanism, civil society. There's a lot of these actors and organizations which step up and provide. Obviously, there's a tradition in that in the US. One of these questions talks about the current migrant crises and talks about should we have quasi-government organizations like Refugees' Lives Matter as well. Are those going to be better solutions as we head towards not just the current regime, but just in thinking about these governments are always going to be. The parallel of that would be obviously faculty senates in universities, which is another kind of conversation which is beginning to happen. Is that the way we should be thinking?
Well, I mean, I'm going to take the last thing you said first and work backwards, but for sure, reclaiming university governance and the faculty's role in university governance, so actively being engaged on our campuses and taking back the reins is incredibly important. Most of the very repressive policies that were adopted for this academic year over the summer break were undertaken with no faculty input or very little faculty input. And it's just one of many, many signs that there is something that's really awry in the way that universities are being governed internally at this point, and we need to assert our own collective voices, and I think that's incredibly important. And I think that now generalizes nationally. I mean, the thing you're describing, refugee rights matter, whatever matter, it's really about building power from the ground up. And the way you do that and the way you prevail in a democracy with the argument is you persuade people and you get them working together on a set of collective actions. And that's how you move the dial of the government. I mean, at some level, again, in a democracy that has as many veto points and as many counter-majoritarian features as our democracy does, it's not simple to say, how does one gain the reins of power? But definitely one way to do that is by persuading a majority of our fellow citizens of the positions that we take. And so the only way we're going to do that is having a better ground game. And one thing that, I mean, to the extent that people broadly identify in partisan ways in this country, having either a better ground game on the part of the party that supports these values, or thinking creatively about how to develop other vehicles through which to express them is absolutely urgently necessary. I think that we've seen many problems with how democracy has unfolded over the last 2 decades, let's say, including the fact that, very rarely do popular majorities actually translate into electoral success in this country at the level of the executive, although it has been the case this year. So yes, building power.
We have 3 more areas, so I'm going to now push you to give me 1 minute or minute and a half responses to each. They can be very quick. There's an interesting question about turning kind of the current solidarity with Muslims and Arabs to actually address issues in Muslim and Arab countries, sort of take these forces. And you see this actually within Muslim and Arab communities as well. There's a lot of questioning, some divisiveness as well in these communities, but questioning. Should we turn this force and actually go up and fix places where we all came from?
God forbid. I mean, there is, very, very little evidence that the United States as a government, or for that matter, that diaspora communities emanating from the United States have had a constructive or positive effect on the states of the Middle East and the states of the Muslim world more generally. I actually wasn't one of the things I disliked the most when I was a law student was having faculty ask me whether I hoped to go back and be prime minister of Turkey. And here I was, a Turkish American kid going to law school and just wondering why do they think me studying the idiosyncrasies of the American legal system would qualify me in any way to run a different country or persuade my countrymen there that I would be better equipped to govern. We're not better equipped. We don't understand the specific challenges on the ground that those communities are facing. If we want to move and live there and have skin in the game for a long time, that's one thing. But the idea that the United States as a government or a country or diaspora communities within it, who tend to exhibit the characteristics of all diaspora communities of being more royalist than the king, and having forms of nationalism that are actually quite toxic, that any of these communities are well placed to solve problems in another country elsewhere is a delusion.
There's a specific question actually about just your opinions on the ICC warrants and how this will affect international affairs and UN guidance, or just, I guess, the UN's legitimacy.
A 90-second answer. Well, ICC warrants are extraordinary. They went through a process that no other investigation on the part of the ICC has ever gone through. The prosecutor was unbelievably cautious. The first attempt to start an investigation of the situation in Palestine began in 2009. Nothing was done for, whatever, until basically 2023. There was no real action moving forward. It wasn't until 2021 that there was an authorization to even think about moving forward. It's gone through so many pretrial chamber and other authorization processes. An entire committee of international law experts was convened by the prosecutor before he issued the warrants to make sure that the grounds on which he was issuing the warrants were valid. So in other words, the degree of care that's been given and caution in this instance is extraordinary, and for good reason, because the institution is very worried about being targeted. There's a history, again, under the Trump administration of placing visa restrictions and direct sanctions on personnel of the International Criminal Court when the court takes actions that the United States doesn't like, despite the United States not being a member. And currently, the Israeli government is on the warpath against the institution. Having said that, the only way for international institutions to be deemed legitimate globally and to be able to deliver on the promise of international law is to be able to enforce law in ways that are not deeply and consistently and systematically selective. And anything that can be done, whether by the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court or the United Nations system or others, to show that when even very powerful actors engage in gross and systematic violations of international law, there will be some measure of scrutiny, some possibility, which is all that those arrest warrants suggest, right? There are many more opportunities to challenge the case on the merits, even on jurisdictional grounds still, but that there could be a structure that could hold them to account in some way. It actually strengthens and bolsters the legitimacy of those institutions. One need only cast one's mind back to the UN's refusal to authorize the invasion of Iraq by the United States. That was a very costly decision. It was a very risky decision. It was the right decision as a matter of international law. And in the end, had the UN done any differently, it would have been permanently delegitimized.
We talked a bunch, so last question. This is more about information campaigns or disinformation. Obviously, we're living in a world where everything can now be faked. How impactful, two questions here. How impactful is this information war? How do we ensure that it's fair and transparent? Are we losing the information war? Is there roles we can play? What should we be thinking about this?
I mean, here is a place that the university needs to, focus enormous attention, because there is not just an information war afoot, but we are on the cusp of a digital revolution that has the potential to radically transform all of our lives. It's emanating from the kind of research done at universities, but there are no meaningful controls in place. There is very little thought being given to what an adequate regulatory infrastructure would look like, or who would be in charge of that infrastructure. I don't think it should be nation states, because this is a technology that is of global scope and is having global consequences that we're seeing already in every aspect of our lives. And so here is a place where, if not the university, where? It's not that I can give you a blueprint, but that I know where to turn to try to begin to develop the interdisciplinary, cross field, trans-substantive kinds of research teams that could at least think about the many dimensions of the puzzle.
I think it's a great way to end, both in terms of where we started, which is, or at least halfway through, where we talked about the positive hope was our campuses, our students. And in many ways, your, I think, very compelling kind of defense of why we should be arguing for diverse conversations. And now there's a world in which we don't know how to tell the truth from fiction. And again, in that world, campuses could be the prime places where that's what we do. You go to any seminar in any one of our disciplines, you can see what happens in those contexts as well. And so bringing some of that deliberative processes which help us arrive at some measure of relative truth could be a great direction. Aslı, this has been fascinating. I wish we could keep talking for more time. I think, often a conversation plateaus out and you're like, okay, I think I've learned as much. This is sadly a conversation we're in the very convex sport of learning. I'm very grateful to you doing that, and I hope for our audience this has whet their appetite to read more of what you are writing, but also start linking back to what we hope academics and academia can produce and stimulate. So I'm really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Asim, for having me for this great conversation. And yeah, I hope the first of many.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Aslı and Asim, for joining us today and for sharing your perspectives. And of course, thanks to everyone in the audience for being here today and for your excellent questions. I hope you'll join us again soon, and you can find more information about upcoming programs on Radcliffe's website. I hope you have a wonderful evening.